Have you ever considered how a sport could dismantle an empire's illusion? Not with armies marching across borders, not with speeches echoing through halls of power, but with fists. Imagine a world where your strength is dismissed before you even stand up, where your intelligence is doubted before you speak a single word, where the outcome of your effort is decided long before the bell rings, because history has already labeled you inferior. For decades, this was the reality for the Philippines. A nation told, subtly and repeatedly, that greatness belonged elsewhere. That discipline was learned, not possessed. That dominance was natural, so long as it remained in Western hands. Then something dangerous happened. Filipino boxers began to win, not quietly, not politely, not in ways that could be ignored or explained away. They won under blinding lights, in foreign arenas, before crowds that never expected to cheer for them. They won against opponents who had been promised victory before the fight even began. And with every raised hand, something invisible began to fracture. Because these were not just victories, they were contradictions. Each punch landed against an idea far older than the fighters themselves. The idea that some people were born to rule and others were born to accept it. This is not a story about sport. It is a story about what happens when dignity refuses to stay silent, when it steps into the ring, when it absorbs the blows, and when, finally, it fights back. At the start of the 20th century, international sport was never neutral. It only pretended to be. Beneath the rules, the referees, and the applause, it was shaped by empire, by the same forces that divided the world into rulers and subjects. Western nations didn't just dominate politics and trade, they dominated the imagination. They decided what strength looked like, what discipline meant, who was allowed to be celebrated, and who was expected to remain in the background. Strength was defined in European terms, discipline was treated as a Western inheritance, and victory, almost by default, belonged to white athletes long before competition even began. Non-Western competitors were not evaluated. They were categorized, entertaining, exotic, inferior. They existed to fill programs, not to win them. In the Philippines, under American colonial rule, the expectation was unspoken, but absolute. Participate, entertain, lose. Boxing was introduced as a pastime, a controlled outlet, a spectacle meant to amuse, not to empower. No one imagined it would become a weapon. No one imagined that inside a simple ring, ropes, canvas, and a bell, the myths of empire would begin to crack. The first Filipino boxers did not step into the ring thinking about history. They weren't chasing legacy. They weren't trying to rewrite the world or challenge empires. They were fighting hunger. They were fighting poverty. They were fighting the quiet suffocation of limited choices, the kind that traps entire lives before they ever begin. For them, boxing was not romance. It was not symbolism. It was a way out, or a way under. The ring was not a stage for meaning. It was survival. But once the bell rang, something extraordinary happened. The ring did what empires could not. It stripped away excuses, stripped away titles, stripped away uniforms, passports, and inherited authority. It stripped away the stories men told themselves about who they were supposed to be. Inside those ropes, there were no colonizers, no subjects, no masters, and no servants, only fighters, flesh against flesh, breath against breath, will against will. When Filipino boxers traveled abroad, expectations followed them like shadows, heavy, inescapable, already written. They were supposed to fall early, supposed to absorb punishment, supposed to make others look heroic in victory. They were meant to be part of the spectacle, never the outcome. But instead they disrupted rhythm. They refused the pace they were given. They forced opponents to adjust, to doubt, to hesitate. They fractured confidence. They turned certainty into panic. They made champions look human. And sometimes, under blinding lights and hostile crowds, with judges, promoters, and history stacked against them. They broke champions. Each victory landed like an accusation, not just against the man across the ring, but against an entire belief system. A belief that dominance was natural, that hierarchy was inevitable, that power flowed in one direction and always had, that some men were born to rule and others were born to accept it quietly. And with every win, every fallen favorite, every stunned arena, every rewritten headline, that belief became harder to defend. Because the ring kept asking the same question: if this was natural, why did it keep failing? These wins did not stay inside the ring. They crossed oceans. They crossed borders. They crossed something far more difficult: belief. Back home, the results moved faster than ships ever could. Through radios crackling in the night, carrying voices across islands, through headlines passed from hand to hand, folded and reread until the paper thinned. Through word of mouth whispered in markets, in homes, in street corners where hope had learned to speak quietly. People didn't just celebrate fighters, they recognized themselves. For the first time, Filipinos watched their countrymen stand across the ring from representatives of nations that ruled the world, and win. Not once, not by accident, but again and again. Victories that could not be dismissed as luck, performances too decisive to ignore. And something shifted. Not loudly, not all at once, quietly at first, almost imperceptibly. A posture changed, a conversation paused, a doubt loosened its grip. If we can win there, if we can dominate on their stages, if we can outperform those we were taught to fear, what else have we been told incorrectly? The question lingered in classrooms, in kitchens, in crowded streets and distant provinces. It lingered because it had no easy answer. Boxers became symbols, whether they wanted to or not just athletes, but evidence, carriers of a message far heavier than any belt. Their victories said what decades of speeches never could, what petitions and promises had failed to deliver. That inferiority was not destiny. It was not written into blood or birth. It was a lie, repeated so often it began to sound like truth. And with every raised hand, that lie weakened. With every stunned arena, it lost credibility. With every headline, it fractured further. Because now, millions had seen otherwise. They had seen discipline without permission, excellence without approval, victory without apology. And once a people see themselves clearly, once they glimpse what they are capable of, they cannot be unseen again. As victories accumulated, denial became impossible. At first it was dismissed, explained away, labeled coincidence, a lucky night, a careless opponent, a mistake that would soon be corrected. But the wins kept coming. One fight became two. Two became a pattern. And patterns demand explanation. Promoters stopped laughing, stopped treating Filipino fighters as convenient undercards meant to warm the crowd. They began placing them carefully, because risk had entered the equation. Opponents trained harder, trained longer, trained with a seriousness born not from respect, but from fear. Because arrogance was no longer affordable, preparation replaced assumption. Gyms adjusted strategies. Coaches studied footage they once ignored. Names that had been mispronounced were now circled in red. Commentators changed their language. Subtly at first, almost reluctantly. Not fast for their size, just fast. Not disciplined for their background, just disciplined. Not surprisingly, skilled, simply skilled. The qualifiers disappeared because the evidence left no room for them. Filipino boxers were no longer framed as exceptions to a rule. They were the rule being rewritten. They were threats. Threats to reputations built on certainty. Threats to rankings designed for predictability. Threats to a system that had grown comfortable deciding outcomes before the bell ever rang. And that shift mattered. because sport has always claimed to be fair, even when it rarely was, and fairness is only tested when expectation fails. Respect in sport, real respect, is not granted out of kindness. It is not given out of guilt. It is not offered as charity to correct past injustice. Respect is extracted through preparation that refuses to be overlooked, through endurance that outlasts doubt, through the willingness to walk into hostile spaces, under hostile assumptions, and perform anyway. It is earned in places where excuses don't survive, where reputation collapses under pressure, where truth reveals itself in motion. And once extracted, once the world is forced to adjust, it cannot be taken back. The true impact of Filipino boxing cannot be measured in titles alone. Belts tarnish. Records are broken. Names fade from scorecards and headlines, replaced by the next contender, the next moment. But precedent endures. What Filipino boxing created was not just a lineage of champions, but a permanent shift in what was considered possible for an entire people. For the first time, future generations grew up knowing something crucial, something their parents and grandparents had been denied, not by fate, but by narrative, that the world could be challenged, not politely, not symbolically, not from a distance, but directly. They grew up knowing that excellence did not belong to one race, one flag, one hemisphere. That greatness was not reserved for those born into power or proximity to it, not inherited, not protected. Before, boxing global recognition felt distant, abstract, something to admire from afar, as if greatness lived somewhere else, somewhere unreachable. But boxing collapsed that distance, because it proved that equality was not a theory debated in books or promised in speeches. It was a performance, measured in timing, in preparation, in the ability to withstand pressure when everything, crowd, history, expectation, pushed against you. Inside the ring, Filipinos did not argue for fairness. They demonstrated it. They showed that skill did not need translation, that discipline did not require approval, that courage did not depend on permission. They showed that excellence spoke fluently in any language. And once that truth was made visible, it could not be erased, because visibility changes memory, and memory reshapes identity. Boxing became the first mirror where Filipinos saw themselves clearly on a global stage, not as subjects, not as guests, not as exceptions, but as equals. That mirror mattered, because for young Filipinos watching from crowded homes, narrow streets, and distant provinces, this wasn't about sport. It was about possibility. They saw men who looked like them, spoke like them, came from streets like theirs, standing under foreign lights in hostile arenas, refusing to shrink. They saw composure where panic was expected, intelligence where instinct was assumed, confidence without arrogance. They saw proof, and slowly, quietly, something fundamental changed. Aspiration expanded. The ceiling lowered. What once felt unreachable became imaginable. What once felt forbidden became familiar. Because if it could happen there, on the world's biggest stages, against the world's most favored opponents, then maybe limitation itself had been exaggerated. Maybe it had always been. This legacy did not end with boxing. It bled outward, into other sports, into culture, into identity. Filipinos began entering global arenas with a different posture, straighter, more deliberate, less apologetic, not asking whether they belonged, but assuming they did. And that assumption mattered, because confidence, once internalized, reshapes behavior. It changes how people speak, how they negotiate, how they compete, how they claim space. It changes what they tolerate and what they refuse. Boxing taught a lesson no textbook ever could. That respect does not arrive through waiting. It does not arrive through pleading. It does not arrive through hope alone, it arrives through action. That dignity is not granted by systems built without you in mind. It is taken through excellence so undeniable it forces recognition. Filipino boxers did not beg to be seen. They made invisibility impossible. They did not ask the world to reconsider its biases. They confronted them, round after round, fight after fight, year after year, under lights that weren't built for them, under rules that didn't favor them, against expectations, designed to limit them. And in doing so, they changed the trajectory of expectation itself, not just for themselves, but for everyone who came after. Because once a people see themselves as equals, truly see it, they stop asking for permission. They stop shrinking their ambition. They stop negotiating their worth. They stop accepting ceilings that were never meant to protect them, only to contain them. That is the true legacy of Filipino boxing. Not the titles, not the applause, not the temporary glory, but the moment an entire nation realized it no longer needed validation to claim its place on the world stage, not begging for recognition, taking it. Today, representation is discussed as a modern struggle, as if visibility were newly invented, as if recognition began with language, as if history waited for permission to name injustice before resisting it. But long before the words existed, the fight was already happening. In silence, in sweat, in blood. Long before. Movements had names. Filipino boxers were already confronting a world that had decided who mattered and who did not. They did not march. They did not petition. They did not ask to be included. They understood something instinctively, that some systems are not persuaded. They are exposed. So they stepped into rings where the outcome had been written in advance and rewrote it with their bodies, under lights that were not meant for them, before crowds that did not expect them to win, against opponents who carried not just skill, but assumption. Filipino boxers did not ask the world to reconsider its bias. They forced it to, not with arguments, not with outrage, not with demands, but with repetition, one bell, one round, one victory at a time. Each fight was a confrontation, not just with an opponent, but with history itself. Every punch landed against a narrative older than the fighters, a narrative that said excellence had borders, that greatness had a color, that dignity had to be granted by those in power. They proved otherwise, because the ring is an unforgiving place. It does not reward intention. It does not respect mythology. It does not care what the world expects. It only acknowledges what can be sustained under pressure. And under that pressure, Filipino boxers endured. They endured the stares that questioned their presence, the doubts that followed them from gym to arena, the hostile crowds, the uneven expectations, the silent hope that they would fail quietly. They endured because they had to, because dignity was not something waiting on the other side of fairness. It was not promised by time. It was not guaranteed by progress. It had to be taken. Sometimes dignity doesn't arrive through permission. It arrives through resistance, resistance that does not announce itself, resistance that does not seek validation, resistance that does not ask to be understood, resistance that simply refuses to lose. And that resistance echoes. It echoes long after the bell rings, long after the crowd disperses, long after the fighters leave the ring. It echoes in every Filipino athlete who steps onto a global stage without apology, in every competitor who no longer questions whether they belong there, in every young person who grows up knowing that excellence does not need translation. Those early boxers did not know how far their impact would travel. They did not know they were laying groundwork. They did not know they were changing the language of possibility. They did not know their survival would become instruction. They were just surviving. But history listens to survival. It listens closely to those who endure without permission. And it remembers who refused to bend. What they left behind was not just a legacy of wins or a collection of belts and records. It was a blueprint for dignity, a reminder that power does not always announce itself loudly, that it does not always arrive with applause or recognition. Sometimes it waits patiently, absorbing doubt, absorbing resistance, absorbing pressure, and then strikes with precision. The world changed not because it wanted to, but because it had no choice, because evidence accumulated, because victories stacked up, because myths collapsed under the weight of reality. And once the illusion was broken, it could not be repaired. That is why this story still matters, not because of nostalgia, not because of pride alone, but because it reminds us of something fundamental. That representation is not granted by progress. It is not gifted by systems that once excluded you. It is claimed by courage. That dignity is not a favor, not a concession, not a compromise. It is a stance, held when it is uncomfortable, defended when it is costly, repeated when it is doubted, one bell, one round, one victory at a time. And that is how resistance becomes legacy, and how legacy becomes permanent. Because when dignity is earned this way, through pain, discipline, and refusal, it does not fade. It does not retreat. It does not ask to be remembered. It echoes forever.